He wasn't expecting trouble that night. He was just heading home after a long shift, tired but relieved to finally breathe. But before he could even reach his own doorstep, a pair of headlights locked onto him. Slow, deliberate, and unblinking. Within seconds, everything changed. A simple walk turned into a terrifying accusation, and a stranger's prejudice became a weapon aimed directly at his life. What followed would expose a truth far darker than the night he was walking through. What really happened on that quiet street, and why was he the one targeted? But if he thought that moment was the beginning of the nightmare, he had no idea what awaited him next. Before everything spiraled out of control, his life was quiet, simple in a way most people never stop to appreciate. He woke up early, worked long hours at a warehouse across town, and came home each evening to the same small apartment he'd lived in for years. Nothing fancy, nothing glamorous, just a place he'd built through steady work and stubborn hope. People in the neighborhood knew him as the guy who always held the door open, who helped carry groceries for the older residents, who never raised his voice even when life gave him every reason to. And for the longest time, he believed that was enough. Being kind, being patient, being the sort of person who tried to make the world a little lighter. He'd seen racism before, of course, but he'd learned to navigate around it, to swallow the stares, to pretend he didn't notice the way some people stiffened when he walked into a room. He told himself it was better to stay calm, better to keep his head down, better not to make waves. But lately, the neighborhood had felt different. A new officer patrolling the area. A few comments from neighbors that didn't sit right. A car he kept noticing, idling too long, headlights lingering a little too deliberately. Still, he pushed the unease aside, convincing himself it was nothing. Life had taught him that speaking up too soon could backfire. So he kept moving, kept smiling, kept pretending that the world wasn't shifting around him in ways he couldn't yet see. What he didn't realize was that the small, quiet life he'd worked so hard to build was already cracking, and the next moment would shatter completely. Because the night everything changed was only a heartbeat away. He first noticed a shift on a Wednesday night. A night like any other, quiet, still, and heavy with the kind of tiredness that only long hours can bring. He stepped off the bus, hands tucked in his pockets, letting the cool air settle his thoughts. But as he turned down his usual street, the uneasy feeling returned. That same car, the same headlights, the same slow crawl in the shadows behind him. He tried to ignore it. He told himself he was imagining things. But the rhythmic hum of the engine followed him step for step, like an unwelcome shadow that refused to fall back. Then came the voice, sharp, cold, and cutting through the dark like a blade. "Hey, you, stop where you are." He stopped, but not because he wanted to. His body froze on instinct, the kind of instinct taught not by books or mentors, but by stories of people who never made a home. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. The officer inside the car didn't step out right away. He just stared, the kind of stare that stripped away humanity and replaced it with suspicion. There was no broken law, no disturbance, no reason, only the color of his skin. The officer finally climbed out, hand resting on the holster, as if danger stood before him instead of a man with a backpack and exhaustion. Every step the officer took seemed louder than the last. He forced a calm expression, forced steady breathing, forced himself not to show fear, because fear could be interpreted as guilt, and guilt could be interpreted as threat. He answered every question carefully. Where he worked, why he was walking, where he lived. Nothing he said mattered. The officer's eyes were already full of conclusion he didn't deserve. But the night didn't end there. From that moment on, the harassment wasn't occasional. It became a pattern. The car showing up outside his building. The officer questioning him multiple times a week. Being followed on his way to work. Being stopped while buying groceries. He was no longer living. He was being hunted by suspicion, judged by someone who didn't even know him. Neighbors whispered. Some crossed the street to avoid him. Others watched from their porches as if waiting for him to slip, to fall, to give the officer the excuse he seemed desperate for. Even his co-workers noticed he was different. Quieter, distracted, always glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting something terrible to appear at any moment. The worst part? He couldn't prove any of it. There were no witnesses willing to speak. No cameras in the quiet part of town. He called home. It was his word against the badge. One evening, as he walked home late, rain soaking through his jacket, the headlights appeared again. This time faster, closer, angrier. The car slammed to a stop inches from his knees. The officer jumped out, barking orders, accusing him of trying to break into a nearby home, a home he had never even walked past before. The accusation hit him like a punch to the gut. He raised his hand slowly, terrified that any small movement might be the last mistake he ever made. He tried to speak. The officer cut him off. He tried to explain. The officer stepped closer. He tried to breathe. The officer reached for cuffs. He felt helpless, humiliated, furious. But through the fear, a quiet realization settled into his mind. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't caution. This was targeted, intentional, personal. Something in the officer's eyes confirmed it. This man wanted him cornered, wanted him powerless, wanted him to react, to slip, to fail. Because then he'd become exactly what the officer told the world he was. But that night, right before the cuffs locked around his wrists, a neighbor stepped outside, a woman he barely knew. She stared at the scene unfolding, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. And then she pulled out her phone and started recording. The officer froze. His tone changed. His grip loosened. The accusations suddenly softened into routine questions. But the damage was already done. In that moment, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't protection. This wasn't justice. It was harassment fueled by prejudice, and it was escalating fast. What he didn't know was that this recorded moment wouldn't just expose a pattern. It would ignite a chain of events that would shake the entire community and put him in even greater danger. Because the officer wasn't done with him, not even close. The night everything exploded began like any other. Quiet, empty, and wrapped in the kind of stillness that should have felt safe. He had stayed late at work, cleaning up after a shift no one else wanted. By the time he stepped off the bus, the streets were nearly deserted, lit only by the flicker of tired street lamps. He walked with his hood down, hands visible, doing everything he had been conditioned to do to avoid attention. But attention found him anyway. Halfway down the block, the familiar patrol car screeched around the corner, its headlights slicing through the darkness and pinning him in place like a spotlight on a stage. His heart dropped. He already knew who it was. And this time, the energy felt different, sharper, heavier, almost frantic. The officer stepped out, not with caution, but with a storm in his eyes. The accusations came instantly. A break-in had been reported nearby. A suspect matching his description. No explanation. No room to speak. No chance to breathe. The officer advanced with a force that made his stomach twist. He tried to explain he'd just left work, that he had a time card, that he hadn't been anywhere near the reported address. But the officer wasn't listening. He never listened. Then came the moment he'd feared, the officer's hand dropping to his holster, not resting, gripping. He felt the entire world narrow to that single motion. His pulse hammered. His legs trembled. Every story he'd heard, every life lost unjustly, every headline replayed in his head like a warning. He raised his hand slowly, painfully aware that even breathing wrong could be interpreted as defiance. But this time there were witnesses. From the corner of his eye, he saw silhouettes emerging from porches and apartment windows. People who had ignored the earlier confrontations. People who had pretended not to notice before. But now, with the officer shouting and reaching for his weapon, something changed. A neighbor stepped into the street. Then another, and then phones came out. 1, then 5, then nearly a dozen glowing screens capturing every second. The officer yelled at the crowd to step back, but no one moved. He shouted that they were interfering, that they didn't understand the situation. But they did understand. They had watched him stalk this man for weeks. They had watched the questions, the harassment, the stops with no cause. And tonight, they saw what he was about to do. The officer's voice cracked with frustration. His anger grew as the cameras kept recording. His hand still hovered near the holster, shaking with something that wasn't fear, but something far more dangerous. Pride mixed with desperation. He barked an order for backup, but his radio crackled uselessly. The crowd closed in not aggressively, but firmly, forming a human barrier around the man he'd cornered. For the first time, the officer hesitated, and in that hesitation, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't suspicion. This wasn't law enforcement. This was a man abusing power, and a community finally refusing to look away. The officer tried one last time to salvage control by lunging forward, grabbing the man's arm as if to force an arrest. But the movement was caught on every camera. The crowd shouted. A woman stepped forward, yelling that he was unarmed, that he had done nothing. Another neighbor identified herself loudly as the person who had filmed the earlier harassment. Suddenly, the officer wasn't the one in control. He was the one exposed. And for the first time in weeks, the man felt a flicker of hope break to the fear tightening his chest. Sirens suddenly echoed in the distance, backup arriving. But this time, those sirens didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a turning point. The officer stepped back, visibly unraveling as the recording phones held steady, capturing his every move, his every word, his every overreach. When the backup officers arrived, they didn't rush him. They didn't draw weapons. They saw the cameras. They saw the crowd. And they saw the trembling officer whose story no longer made sense. For a moment, everything stood still. The crowd, the flashing lights, the officer breathing hard like a man caught in the middle of his own lie. And that was the moment the entire narrative shifted. The moment the truth cracked open wide enough for the whole world to see. But what happened next, what the police discovered and what the community demanded, would turn this confrontation into a reckoning no one could have predicted. He didn't speak for a long time. Even after the officers backed away, even after the crowd dispersed, even after the flashing lights faded into the night, leaving the street cold and strangely quiet, he just stood there, hands trembling, chest tight, heart trying to catch up with everything his mind was still replaying. He had survived it, but survival didn't feel like victory. It felt like a reminder. When he finally walked the rest of the way home, every shadow felt like a threat. Every sudden sound made him flinch. His own footsteps echoed louder than they ever had before. And when he reached his front door, his so-called safe place, he realized he didn't feel safe at all. Inside, he sank into a chair and stared at his hands. The same hands the officers had shouted at. The same hands they thought were dangerous. The same hands that had been raised in surrender to a crime he never committed. And that was the part that broke him the most. Not the shouting, not the guns pointed his way, not even the fear of dying. It was knowing that in their eyes, his existence alone was enough to justify suspicion. For the next few days, he tried to move on, go back to work, go back to routines, pretend everything was normal. But the world around him looked different. People smiled at him in grocery aisles, but he couldn't help wondering if they'd cross the street, if they saw him at night. His co-workers said they were glad he was okay, as if okay was even close to the truth. He wasn't okay. He was changed. He started sleeping with the lights on. He avoided walking alone, even in broad daylight. And every time he passed a police car, something deep inside him tensed, as if bracing for a repeat of that night. But with time, slowly, painfully, his fear transformed into something else. Resolve. Because the more he thought about it, the more he realized the story wasn't just his. It was part of a pattern, one stitched across generations, communities, and lives. A pattern where people who looked like him had to walk more carefully, speak more politely, and live more cautiously just to survive. He had almost become another name. Another headline, another tragic misunderstanding. And he knew he couldn't stay silent, and so he told his story. First to friends, then to co-workers, then publicly at a community meeting where his voice shook but didn't break. He spoke about the fear, the humiliation, the injustice, and as he looked out into the crowd, he realized something powerful. People were listening, some with tears, some with guilt, some with anger, but they were listening. The incident didn't just change him, it changed the people who heard him. It reminded them that racism isn't always loud. It isn't always obvious. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of assumptions, judgments, or split-second decisions that can end a life. Sometimes it hides behind badges or policies or protocols. And sometimes it surfaces on an ordinary night, on an ordinary street, turning a simple walk home into a fight for survival. He still carries a memory of that night. The fear never disappears completely,